Picture the winter night of January 28, 1457. Winds from the Atlantic hurling themselves against the gray Welsh cliffs, carrying salt spray that seeped into the cracks of Pembroke Castle. The fortress, centuries old, stood like a stone sentinel above the dark waters of Milford Haven. Inside, the walls did not keep out the cold, they simply held it prisoner. The air in the upper chambers was sharp enough to sting the lungs. In one of those chambers, lit only by flickering candlelight and the dull glow of the hearth, a girl lay writhing on a bed piled with linen sheets already stained deep crimson. She was 13 years old, barely past the age when most girls would still be chasing geese through a manor yard, and her name was Margaret Beaufort. Her hair, damp with sweat, clung to her temples, and her small hands clutched the bedclothes until her knuckles whitened. The pain came in crushing waves, each one longer, sharper, more merciless than the last. Midwives moved around her with the steady urgency of women who had seen too many such nights end in death. Their shadows danced grotesquely on the walls as they muttered Latin prayers to the Virgin Mary and Saint Margaret of Antioch, the saint invoked to protect mothers in childbirth. A pot of lavender and roseberry smoldered on the hearth, the herbs intended to ease pain and guard against evil spirits, though the sharp scent barely masked the iron tang of blood. Margaret's body was not ready for this. Her hips were too narrow, her bones still lengthening, her strength still that of a child. Yet here she was, charged with bringing into the world a boy who would one day, though no one in this room could see it yet, claim the crown of England. The midwives feared for her life, and not without reason. Outside, snow fell in silent veils across the frozen ground. In the stables, the horses shifted uneasily, sensing the tension. The sea wind rattled the shutters like a thief trying the locks. Inside, however, there was no sound but the girls' screams and the low voices of the women. Even the fire seemed subdued, its flames casting a red glow that made the chamber resemble a battlefield more than a birthing room. Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, waited in the corridor beyond the heavy oak door. He was not merely her protector, but her brother-in-law, the younger brother of Edmund Tudor, Margaret's husband, now dead these past months. Edmund had left her with nothing but his name, his cause, and the child struggling to be born. Jasper knew that if both mother and child were lost, the Tudor line would vanish into the winter night as surely as the snowflakes disappearing into the sea. Margaret's mind, in the moments that pain let her think, wandered strangely between prayer and memory. She remembered the gardens of Bletsoe Castle, where she had played as a little girl before politics had taken her childhood away. She remembered her mother's face, stern, beautiful, and unyielding, telling her that noble blood was both gift and burden. And she remembered her wedding to Edmund, the vows spoken in the great hall under the eyes of ancestors who stared down from embroidered tapestries. The contractions came harder now, robbing her of breath. One of the midwives, a weathered Welsh woman named Dame Gwen, leaned over her and spoke softly in their shared tongue, promising her strength she did not feel she had. They had been at this for hours, and each hour stole more of Margaret's will. The truth, though no one dared to speak it out loud, was that many young mothers in such a state never left the bed alive. The midwives had prepared for all outcomes, linen strips for swaddling, and others for shrouding, potions to quicken the womb, and others to ease a passing soul. And always, always, prayers whispered between clenched teeth. Somewhere beyond the walls the sea roared, and in that chamber, with the smoke of rosemary and the bitter edge of fear in the air, history waited, impatiently, for its next breath.
Margaret Beaufort had not arrived at this night by chance. nor by choice. She carried in her veins a river of royal blood, descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of King Edward III. That connection alone made her a valuable pawn in the deadly chess game of 15th century England. But in an age where the Wars of the Roses were brewing, such blood was a double-edged sword. It could crown you or kill you. In the brittle hierarchy of the realm, lineage was both a shield and a target. Margaret's family name commanded respect, yet it also painted a mark upon her back. In the minds of ambitious lords, a girl like Margaret was a marriage contract waiting to be signed, a means to secure power through heirs. But in the eyes of rivals, she was a threat that could be removed as easily as a candle snuffed in the wind. She was born in May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, Bedfordshire, to John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. The castle's thick stone walls had witnessed centuries of noble intrigue, yet none could have foreseen the shadow that would fall over Margaret's early years. Her father, a celebrated commander under King Henry VI, had been sent to France during the last brutal stages of the 100 Years' War. There, he faced defeat after defeat as English territories slipped away like sand through desperate fingers. The war consumed more than England's lands. It consumed men's honor. For a knight and nobleman like John Beaufort, failure was poison to the soul. In 1444, he returned to England, his once proud posture bent beneath the invisible weight of disgrace. Court observers whispered of a haunted look in his eyes, of long hours spent staring at nothing, as if already hearing the dirge for his own reputation. On May 27, 1444, he was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official cause? Fever. But fever was a convenient fiction. In an age steeped in suspicion, few believed it. Some murmured of poison. After all, in noble circles, a cup could hide as many blades as a dagger. Others spoke of his own hand, ending a life that could not bear the stain of defeat. For Margaret, too young to understand the full truth, his death was a shadow without a shape, a wound without a clear cause. Her mother, the Dowager Duchess, wasted no time securing her daughter's future. In a world where the fortunes of women and children rose or fell with alliances, survival meant marrying into protection and influence. By the age of 6, Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, heir to the Duke of Suffolk. It was not a match for affection, it was an investment, binding two powerful houses into mutual security. But politics, like the tides, could turn without warning. In 1450, the Duke of Suffolk was accused of treason, blamed for negotiating the unpopular surrender of Maine and Anjou to France. His enemies seized him at sea, and in a display both brutal and theatrical, they dragged him to the ship's gunwale, forcing him to kneel before striking off his head with a rusted sword. It took several blows. His body was left to the waves, a warning to those who played the political game poorly. That grisly death dissolved Margaret's betrothal overnight. In the dangerous currents of court life, her value was recalculated, her alliances reshaped. She learned long before she was old enough to fully grasp the cruelty of it, that in England's noble courts, affection was irrelevant, survival was everything, and promises were only made to be broken when expedience demanded it. These lessons, taught not in classrooms but in the corridors of power, would shape her into the woman who, decades later, could navigate the deadliest politics of her time and emerge not only alive but triumphant. But for now, she was still a child, one with royal blood that could open doors or sign her death warrant, depending on who held the key.
Margaret's father, John Beaufort, was more than just a name on her family tree. He was a man who had once stood at the very center of England's ambitions abroad. As the first Duke of Somerset, he carried the expectations of a nation still basking in the fading glory of Henry V's victories in France. But the 100 Years' War had entered its bitter twilight, and Beaufort's command came not in the age of conquest, but in the season of loss. In 1443, he was sent across the Channel with an English army, tasked with holding the hard-won territories of Maine and Anjou. Yet fortune had turned. The French, emboldened and reorganized under Charles VII, pressed the English relentlessly. Castles that had once flown the banner of St. George fell one by one. Each surrender was a public humiliation, each retreat a blow to the Duke's honor. The war that had once been a proving ground for glory had become a slow march into disgrace. Contemporaries noted the change in him when he returned to England the following year. The tall, confident commander seemed diminished, his voice quieter, his gaze often vacant. Court gossip said he had the look of a man who had left part of his soul in France. The poetically inclined whispered that he walked as though the ghosts of lost battles followed at his heels. Then came the final blow. His political enemies, already circling like carrion birds, moved to undermine him. Accusations of incompetence and betrayal were whispered in the right ears. In a court where perception was as deadly as the sword, Beaufort found himself cornered. And so, on May 27, 1444, in his chamber at Wimborne Minster, his story ended abruptly. The chroniclers gave the official cause as a fever, an all-purpose explanation that required no proof, but the truth was murkier. Some suspected suicide, an act of despair from a man whose pride could not bear the collapse of his military reputation. Others believed poison had been slipped into his cup by rivals eager to remove him without open accusation. The times were ripe for such speculation. Sudden deaths among the nobility were rarely taken at face value. For the 1-year-old Margaret, the implications of her father's death were immediate. She had inherited his blood, and through it his political baggage. The Beaufort name was both illustrious and tainted, prestige tied to whispers of scandal. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, understood the stakes. Widowed, she could no longer afford to let grief dull her instincts. In the high-stakes world of noble survival, hesitation was fatal. She moved quickly, navigating the shifting alliances of the English court to secure her daughter's position. A new betrothal was arranged, this time to John de la Pole, whose father, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, wielded influence at the heart of Henry VI's government. To the Dowager Duchess, this match offered stability, protection, and a potential path to renewed favor at court. But even this careful arrangement was not immune to the turbulence of the age. In 1450, Suffolk's political fortunes collapsed in spectacular fashion. His role in the unpopular peace negotiations with France, which included the surrender of key territories, made him the target of public rage. Parliament accused him of treason, and though the king tried to protect him, Suffolk's enemies took matters into their own hands. As his ship crossed the English Channel, a band of masked men, likely operating under noble orders, stormed aboard. They dragged him to the deck, condemned him without trial, and knelt him over the ship's gunwale. The executioner's sword was dull, and it took several gruesome blows to sever his head. His body was thrown into the sea. His severed head later recovered on the shores of Dover. The news struck like a thunderclap. The betrothal between young Margaret and John de la Pole was instantly nullified. Her carefully plotted path to security dissolved overnight, a reminder that in England's power struggles, one man's downfall could erase a lifetime of planning.
By the time she was 12, Margaret Beaufort was no longer merely a daughter to be guarded. She was a bargaining chip to be moved across the political board. The Wars of the Roses had not yet erupted in open carnage, but tensions between Lancaster and York had begun to seep into every corner of noble life. Marriages were weapons, and Margaret's bloodline, tracing back to John of Gaunt, made her one of the most valuable pieces in the game. Her collapsed betrothal to John de la Pole had left her unbound, and that status was both dangerous and tempting to powerful men. A girl with her pedigree could strengthen a dynasty, or, in the wrong hands, threaten one. The court of Henry VI, fraught with factional rivalries, saw opportunity in her. Enter Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was no ancient nobleman, but the half-brother of King Henry VI, born of a controversial union between Queen Catherine de Valois, the French widow of Henry V, and her Welsh courtier, Owen Tudor. This marriage, conducted in secrecy and scandal, had produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper, whom the king later acknowledged and raised to prominence. Their royal connection was new and not without whispers of illegitimacy, but it was strengthened by the king's favor. For Henry VI, marrying his half-brother to Margaret was a political masterstroke. It tethered the Tudor brothers, whose Welsh blood made them outsiders in the eyes of some nobles, to the venerable Beaufort line, cementing their position in the Lancastrian cause. For Margaret's mother, the match offered the security of royal kinship, though it would come at a steep personal cost to her daughter. In 1455, the wedding was held at Bletsoe Castle, the same stronghold where Margaret had been born. The great hall was dressed for ceremony, its high windows draped in tapestries depicting the martial glories of her Beaufort forebears. In the chapel, beneath the carved effigy of her grandfather, vows were exchanged. Margaret's voice, high and uncertain, was barely audible as she pledged herself to a man more than a decade her senior. Edmund Tudor was a seasoned figure in courtly and military life, accustomed to the company of men in council and the rigors of campaigning. Margaret, in contrast, was still slight and narrow-shouldered, her body not yet shaped for the role expected of her. Yet in the 15th century, there was no concept of waiting for physical maturity when it came to noble brides. The consummation of the marriage was immediate, and for Margaret, deeply traumatic. The private horrors of that night would never be recorded in her own words, but they left marks that would never heal. Physical injuries that would later prevent her from bearing more than one child, and an emotional wound that would drive her into an almost ascetic religious devotion. She clung to prayer not as a ritual, but as a lifeline, a way to impose meaning and order on the suffering that had been forced upon her. Months into the marriage, her body began to change. Whispers among the women in her household confirmed what Margaret herself could scarcely believe: she was with child. Some congratulated her, but others, older and more experienced, looked at her with quiet worry. Pregnancy was a dangerous prospect for any woman in the 15th century, but for one so young and small, it was a mortal gamble. Margaret's own mother watched her with the taut expression of someone who had once survived childbirth herself, knowing that her daughter was attempting it at half her age. At 18, she had been old enough to endure the strain. At 12, Margaret's body was still unfinished, and the child she carried was already feared to be large. But for all the concerns over her health, there was little choice. In noble families, the birth of an heir outweighed the risks to the mother. The Beaufort name was too valuable to be set aside for caution, and the Tudors needed their Lancastrian connection solidified with living flesh and blood. As the months passed, the danger grew, not from childbirth alone, but from the wider world. In the autumn of 1556, Edmund Tudor rode out to Wales on the king's business, commanding forces loyal to Lancaster against the growing strength of the Yorkist cause. It was a campaign that would end not in glory, but in the shadowed walls of Carmarthen Castle, where he was taken prisoner. Whether his death came from plague and confinement or by less natural means is still argued by historians. The official explanation, illness, was neat and politically safe, but others claimed his captors hastened his end to rid themselves of a royal half-brother who might rally opposition. Whatever the truth, Edmund Tudor died before he could see the child he had sired. When the news reached Margaret in the damp chill of Lampy Palace, she was kneeling in the chapel, praying for his safe return. The sound of boots on the stone floor made her turn before the messenger could speak. The look in his eyes told her all she needed to know. She was a widow at 13, heavy with a child, and alone in a kingdom drifting towards civil war. Margaret's union with Edmund Tudor was born of calculation, not affection. It was a bond designed in council chambers, weighed in terms of bloodlines,
alliances, and the unspoken currency of survival. At the time, the Tudor brothers were still relative newcomers to the great game of English politics, royal in name through their half-brother Henry VI, yet still eyed warily by those who valued centuries of pedigree over recent favor. The Beaufort connection gave them a lineage that could not be ignored. For Margaret, the match was a command, not a choice. She had been 12 when the wedding took place, still growing into her limbs, her mind not yet prepared for the role thrust upon her. The ceremony itself at Bletsoe Castle had been rich with pageantry. The embroidered banners, the scent of beeswax candles, the solemn intoning of vows. But behind the gilded veil of ritual lay the harsh truth. She was being drawn into a world where her value would be measured in heirs. Edmund Tudor was a man in his mid-20s, weathered by the demands of court politics and accustomed to getting his way. To him, the marriage was a strategic victory, sealing his family's claim to Lancastrian legitimacy through the Beaufort line. For Margaret, the wedding night was a moment she would carry as a private scar. The medieval noble world offered no reprieve for a bride too young. Consummation was expected immediately, even if the body was ill-suited to bear it. In the months that followed, the consequences began to show. Her belly swelled, her small frame struggling under the weight of a child. Those around her tried to temper their congratulations with concern. She was still so young that her hips had not fully developed, an ominous sign for the birth ahead. The women in her household, seasoned in the grim realities of childbirth, spoke in lowered voices when they thought she could not hear. By late 1456, Edmund had left her behind to campaign in Wales. The kingdom was fracturing, the seeds of the Wars of the Roses already sprouting into armed clashes. Edmund's role as a Lancastrian commander took him deep into contested territory. But war is a dice game played in the open, and in the autumn he lost his throw. Captured by Yorkist forces at Carmarthen Castle, he became a prisoner whose value was as dangerous as it was precious. The official account says he died of plague in his cell that winter. It was a convenient explanation. Disease was a constant in medieval prisons, sparing the need for any direct accusation. But the swiftness of his decline and the refusal of his captors to allow a physician to treat him led many to suspect foul play. In an age when the line between justice and murder was thin and often invisible, such a death could easily be arranged without consequence. Margaret, now in the late months of her pregnancy, received the news at Lampfey Palace. She had been kneeling in the chapel, murmuring prayers for his safe return, when the echo of footsteps on the stone floor announced the messenger. She turned before he spoke, reading the truth in his downcast eyes. Widowed at 13, she would give birth alone. Her husband buried in foreign soil, his ambitions cut short, his child yet to draw breath. In the political world beyond her grief, the implications were clear. She was the last living vessel of Edmund's line, carrying the heir that could continue the Tudor claim. That made her valuable and vulnerable. There would be no retreat into quiet mourning. Instead, the eyes of allies and enemies alike turned toward her belly, measuring its importance against the shifting fortunes of war. When Edmund Tudor died in the chill stone confines of Carmarthen Castle, Margaret's life pivoted sharply into a new, more perilous chapter. She was 13 years old, heavily pregnant, and without a husband in a kingdom that was inching closer to civil war with every passing season. Her position was precarious. No longer simply a noble girl, she was now a widow carrying an unborn heir whose existence could alter the balance of power. The Wars of the Roses had not yet reached their most violent peaks, but the political air was already heavy with the scent of treachery. Allegiances shifted like tides, and those who found themselves unprotected could vanish from the game in the blink of an eye. Margaret's child was not just her own. It was a Tudor heir, half Beaufort, half royal by blood, and thus a potential rallying point for the Lancastrian cause. That meant protection, but it also meant danger from those who might see the child as a future rival. In the days after Edmund's death, the mantle of responsibility fell upon his younger brother, Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke. Jasper was barely into his mid-20s, yet he bore the weight of safeguarding both Margaret and the unborn child. He knew that if she remained unguarded, Yorkist factions could easily intercept her, removing both her and the Tudor heir before they became a threat. His decision was swift. Margaret must be moved to the formidable safety of Pembroke Castle, his stronghold in the wilds of southwest Wales. The journey was no small undertaking. It was the dead of winter, the roads little more than frozen ruts edged with snowdrifts, and every mile carried the risk of encountering armed men whose loyalties were unknown or worse, hostile. Margaret traveled in a horse-drawn litter, its jolting over rough ground sending pain lancing through her swollen belly. The journey, which might have taken 2 days in good weather, stretched to 5. They were forced to navigate around swollen rivers, through narrow forest tracks where ice-laden branches clawed at the litter's sides, and across wind-swept plains where there was no shelter but the cloaks on their backs. When at last Pembroke Castle loomed into view, it was like a stone giant rising from the cliffs above Milford Haven. Built on a limestone outcrop, the fortress had stood for centuries, its great round keep defying both storm and siege. Yet it was not comfort that awaited her inside. The castle in winter was an austere refuge. The wind found its way through every crack in the ancient stone, and the vast fireplaces, though constantly fed with wood, could only warm the spaces immediately before them. Jasper had assigned her chambers hung with thick woolen tapestries to blunt the drafts, and servants worked tirelessly to keep the hearth burning. But the cold was constant. Outside her window, the Atlantic hurled itself against the cliffs, and the air was forever tinged with salt and damp. To Margaret, the castle must have felt both like a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she was safe from the chaos beyond the walls, yet trapped with the knowledge of what awaited her in the birthing chamber. The winter of 1456-57 was one of the harshest in memory. Snow piled high against the outer walls, and ice formed inside the arrow slits of her chamber windows. Margaret, her body still that of a child in many ways, labored under the weight of her pregnancy with mounting exhaustion. She could barely cross her room without stopping to catch her breath. Even simple movement sent waves of pain through her back and hips. The castle's physician, Dr. Louis Carleon, a learned man trained in both Oxford and Paris, examined her with increasing alarm. His hips were too narrow, he warned Jasper. The baby was badly positioned. The birth would be dangerous, possibly fatal. In hushed tones, he spoke of the possibilities. Attempting to turn the child, waiting in the hope that nature might correct the position, or, in the gravest case, performing a cesarean section, an option that almost always claimed the mother's life. These conversations were held behind closed doors, but Margaret must have sensed the urgency in the way her attendants moved, the way they watched her with 2 bright eyes when she winced in pain. In the dim glow of the castle chapel, she prayed longer and harder, kneeling until her knees ached, whispering the names of saints who had once shielded women in childbirth. Outside, the wind clawed at the battlements. Inside, the girl who carried the future of the Tudor name waited for the moment that would either crown her as the mother of a king or make her another forgotten name in the long, cold ledger of noblewomen who had died in childbed.
Margaret's removal to Pembroke Castle was not just a change of residence, it was a calculated maneuver for survival. In the final weeks of 1456, Jasper Tudor understood the stakes with brutal clarity. His brother was dead, his sister-in-law was the vessel of the family's only heir, and the Yorkist tide was rising fast. If Margaret were intercepted en route or left exposed in an unsecured household, the Lancastrian cause could lose not only a claim to legitimacy but its future king before he was even born. The journey began under a sky the color of lead. The roads of southwest Wales were treacherous in winter, nothing more than rutted tracks frozen into jagged ridges, slick with ice and churned mud. Margaret traveled in a covered litter, the thick canvas sides drawn tight against the wind. Each jolt over frozen earth sent pain rippling through her belly, sharp enough to make her grip the wooden frame until her knuckles whitened. Jasper's men rode ahead and behind, a living shield against the possibility of ambush. They carried not only swords, but a knowledge of the land's hidden paths, routes that wove between hills and forests, avoiding the main roads where danger might lurk. They skirted villages entirely, for fear of drawing attention to the small, fragile figure who bore such political weight. The journey, intended to take no more than 2 days, stretched to 5. Rivers had swelled with winter rains, forcing detours far upstream to find crossings where the current wouldn't sweep a horse away. Fallen trees blocked the narrow forest ways, and at least once the party turned back from the sound of armed men somewhere ahead in the mist. By the time the limestone walls of Pembroke Castle rose into sight, Margaret was exhausted beyond words. The fortress dominated the landscape, its great round keep looming above the tidal waters of Milford Haven like a sentinel from another age. Here, in this remote corner of Wales, stone had outlasted generations of men, and it promised protection that no manor house could offer. Yet the first breath of air inside those walls told her this would be no place of comfort. The salt wind swept through the courtyard, stinging the eyes and bringing with it the cold breath of the sea. Pembroke in winter was a place of endurance, not ease. The corridors were dim, lit by torches that sputtered in the drafts. The fireplaces roared, yet only those standing close felt their heat. Beyond their glow, the chill returned. Margaret's chambers were prepared as best the household could manage. Woolen tapestries depicting saints and battles were hung to block the wind seeping through the ancient stones. A great bed, draped with heavy curtains, stood near the hearth, piled with furs. The scent of smoke and damp wool clung to everything. At night, the cry of seabirds and the endless crash of waves against the cliffs made sleep elusive. Still, compared to the uncertainty of the open road, the castle's walls offered a kind of grim security. The fortress had withstood sieges and storms for centuries. The narrow spiral staircases, the high battlements, and the fortified gatehouse were designed not for beauty, but for survival. Margaret soon discovered the rhythms of life in such a place. At dawn, the courtyard rang with the clang of the smith's hammer. Servants carried firewood in endless relays, for the castle devoured it as quickly as they could fetch it. Meals were hearty but plain, roasts, bread, and ale, more for sustaining strength than pleasing the tongue. Yet for all its martial strength, Pembroke could not shield her from the reality growing inside her. The physician, Dr. Lewis Carleon, came often, his brow furrowed with worry. He measured the breadth of her hips, the position of the child, and the strain on her small frame. In private conversations with Jasper, he spoke of his fears. The birth would be difficult, perhaps impossible without harm. Margaret, too, must have sensed the danger. Her prayers in the chapel lengthened, her voice a low murmur in the cold stillness before the altar. She clutched a small carved cross until her fingers cramped, as if the wood itself might anchor her through what was to come. Outside, the Atlantic hurled its endless fury against the cliffs. Inside, in her candlelit chamber, Margaret waited, half a child, half a woman, knowing that the moment she brought life into the world, she might also be stepping into the shadow of her own death.
By midwinter, the tension within Pembroke Castle was palpable. Snow pressed against the high walls, and the wind cut through the battlements like a sharpened blade. Yet it was the atmosphere inside Margaret's chambers that seemed most frigid. Each passing day brought her closer to the birth, and with it, the weight of unspoken fears. Dr. Lewis Carleon, the castle's physician, was no ordinary healer. Educated at Oxford and later in Paris, he carried the authority of decades spent tending both peasants and queens. His hands were steady, his mind sharp, and yet as he examined Margaret, he could not disguise his growing alarm.
Her hips were narrow, too narrow for a child of such size and position. The infant's head was turned awkwardly, wedged in a way that nature might not be able to correct. One bitter afternoon he met with Jasper Tudor in the solar, the chamber's small fire doing little to warm the stone walls. Outside, snow spiraled in tight eddies past the arrow slits. Caroleon spoke in a voice meant only for Jasper's ears. "If the child does not turn," he said, "we may lose them both." They discussed the grim options in hushed tones. Attempting to turn the baby inside the womb might kill both mother and child in an instant. Waiting too long could see Margaret's strength fail before labor was complete, dooming the infant and possibly her as well. And then there was the third path, a cesarean birth, a desperate, near-fatal measure in which the mother almost never survived. Jasper listened with the air of a man trapped between duty and dread. He understood what was at stake. Margaret was not only his brother's widow, but the sole vessel for the Tudor line. If she died, the Lancastrian cause would lose its last tangible hope of producing an heir with Beaufort blood. If she lived but lost the child, the Tudor claim would evaporate. Politics and family affection nodded together in his mind, both pointing toward the same conclusion. Margaret must survive, and so must the child. Meanwhile, Margaret herself was not blind to the danger. She could read it in the faces of those around her, in the way her attendants' eyes lingered when she rose from bed, in the subtle hush that fell whenever her condition was discussed. Though no one spoke of death in her presence, she could feel its shadow gathering in the corners of the room. In response, she clung more tightly than ever to her faith. Hours of her day were spent in the chapel, where the cold stone floor pressed into her knees until they ached. She prayed to the Virgin Mary, to Saint Margaret of Antioch, to every holy protector of women in childbirth. The small carved crucifix she held during these prayers became smooth under her fingers, worn with constant touch. But her religious devotion was more than fear. It was a kind of preparation. Margaret understood, even at her young age, that survival in her world required more than endurance. It required a mind sharpened by knowledge and a spirit anchored by purpose. In the long dark hours between prayers, she began to study. Jasper himself tutored her in matters of statecraft, how to read a man's true thoughts from his silences, how to recognize shifting alliances before they were spoken aloud, how to weigh favors and debts like coin. If the physical act of childbirth would test her body, the years to come would test her mind. And even before the first contraction gripped her, Margaret was steeling herself for both. The sea winds howled against the castle walls. Inside, in a chamber warmed by a roaring fire, but chilled by the tension in every breath, a girl prepared to face the trial that would either make her the mother of a king or leave her name to be spoken of only in mourning.
The night of January 28, 1457 arrived with a kind of inevitability. A pale moon hung over Pembroke's stone keep, casting cold light across the frozen courtyard. Inside, the castle was hushed, except for the sea wind groaning through the arrow slits, as if the ancient stones themselves were bracing for what was to come. Margaret had been walking the battlements earlier that day, following Dr. Carleon's advice that movement might ease the coming birth. She was swaddled in furs, her small frame bent slightly forward under the weight of her belly. But as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the first pains gripped her like a fist. She staggered, clutching the wall, and a low cry escaped her lips. Her attendants, alert even in the dim light, rushed forward. They recognized the look. Labor had begun. By the time she was brought to her chambers, the contractions were rolling in fast, each one sharper than the last. The midwives took over with the calm precision of women who had seen every possible outcome. Dame Gwyn Furch David, the head midwife, was a formidable presence, broad-shouldered, with weathered hands that had delivered children for 30 years. She moved with quiet authority, directing her assistants to stoke the fire higher, heat water, and lay out the tools of their trade. The air soon filled with the pungent smoke of lavender and rosemary burning in the hearth, herbs meant to calm the mother's spirit and ward off evil. Linen sheets were arranged, not only for the birth, but, grimly, for the possibility of a shroud. Beside them lay instruments few outside the birthing chamber ever saw: hooks, forceps, sharp knives, each with a purpose no one wished to speak aloud. Margaret's young body fought the labor with every muscle. The pain was blinding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She clutched the bedpost so hard her nails splintered. Hours passed. The wind outside rose to a howl, rattling the shutters and drowning the muffled prayers of the attendants. Jasper Tudor paced the corridor beyond the heavy door, boots clicking against the flagstones in a restless rhythm. He could hear her cries even through the thick oak, each one cutting through him like a blade. Servants darted past him carrying armfuls of linen in steaming basins of water, their faces pale with the gravity of the moment. Inside, Dame Gwyn worked tirelessly. She shifted Margaret's position, massaged her abdomen to coax the child downward, and whispered encouragement in Welsh between bouts of labor. Other women dabbed her brow, spooned water to her lips, or murmured prayers. But despite their efforts, progress was agonizingly slow. As night deepened into the small hours, Margaret's strength began to falter. Her screams gave way to hoarse groans, the sound of an animal trapped in a snare. The midwives exchanged quick, grim glances. They had seen this before: a child trying to give birth to a child, the human body pushed beyond its natural limits. Father Meredith, the castle's priest, knelt in the chapel below, his voice carrying upward in constant prayer. He invoked every saint he knew, from St. Margaret of Antioch to St. Bridget, asking for the salvation of mother and child alike. 18 hours passed in that crucible of pain and desperation. Every moment stretched taut with the possibility that one or both might not survive until dawn. The air was thick with the mingled scents of blood, smoke, and fear. And still, the struggle went on. In that chamber, illuminated by guttering candlelight and the glow of the fire, the fate of the Tudor line hung by a thread. As the first gray light of dawn seeped through the narrow window, Margaret was barely conscious. Her lips were cracked, her skin pale as bleached linen, and her pulse fluttered weakly beneath the physician's fingers. The midwives knew they were out of time. The baby was alive. They could feel its faint, irregular heartbeat, but it was lodged in a way that threatened them both. Dame Gwyn David made the decision no one wished to speak aloud. With steady hands and a voice that allowed no hesitation, she ordered preparations for manual extraction. It was an act fraught with peril. Done clumsily, it could tear the mother apart or kill the child outright. But without it, both would likely be dead before the sun reached its full height. Margaret was repositioned, her head cradled by one attendant while another whispered prayers into her ear. Dame Gwyn invoked St. Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth, as she began the delicate, brutal work of turning and guiding the child into the world. When at last the infant slid free, the room held its breath. The baby was limp, its skin pale, the only sound the hiss of the fire and Margaret's labored breathing. Then Dame Gwyn cleared its tiny mouth and nose, rubbed its back with brisk determination, and at last, a cry. Thin at first, then stronger, the wail of a life unwilling to be silent. That sound cut through the chamber like sunlight breaking through a storm. Jasper Tudor, waiting outside, froze as the cry reached him. He closed his eyes for a long moment, letting out a breath he had been holding since the night before. The heir to the Tudor name had survived. Margaret, however, was scarcely aware. Her body was shattered, torn and bleeding, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. When the baby was laid upon her chest for the briefest of moments, she stared at him as though memorizing his features through a haze. She would later learn that this child, Henry Tudor, would live to claim the crown of England, ending decades of civil war. But in that moment, he was simply a small, warm weight against her, fragile, real, and alive. The midwives soon whisked the newborn to the hearth to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes followed him with desperate intensity, but her arms were too weak to lift. Her thoughts slipped between lucidity and darkness as Dr. Carolean worked to staunch the bleeding and tend to the internal injuries. His face, usually composed, was set in grim lines. He knew what such trauma meant. Margaret would never bear another child. The Tudor line would rest on this single infant. In the days that followed, fever hovered over her like a shadow. Dr. Carolean employed every remedy he knew, bloodletting to balance the humors, infusions of wine steeped with medicinal herbs, poultices to draw out infection. Dame Gwen never left her side, spooning broth between her cracked lips, wiping the sweat from her brow, speaking to her in the steady, grounding voice of someone who refused to surrender her patient to the dark. But the wounds that could not be seen cut just as deeply. Nightmares plagued her, visions of suffocating under crushing weight, of hearing her own screams in the distance, unable to stop them. She flinched from touch, even from those who came to help her dress or comb her hair. Holding her newborn son brought both fierce love and a flash of terror, for his very presence was bound to the memory of pain. Yet even in her frailty, the steel in her spirit began to show. She understood, with a clarity far beyond her years, that her survival, and her son's, depended not on sentiment, but on strategy. This was no ordinary boy. He was a political asset, a living symbol for the Lancastrian cause. And in a realm already sliding into civil war, such a symbol was both shield and target. While the waves crashed endlessly against Pembroke's cliffs, the girl who had endured a night of unthinkable suffering lay in her chamber and began, quietly, to plan for a future that would demand every ounce of cunning she could muster.
Henry's first weeks of life were wrapped in a strange mix of celebration and unease. Word of his birth spread quickly through Wales and into the courts of England, carried by riders who braved frozen roads to deliver the news. For the Lancastrian loyalists scattered across the realm, the announcement was more than a birth. It was a spark of hope in a season of loss. Yet for every supporter who toasted the newborn's name, there were Yorkist ears listening just as intently, weighing the threat he represented. Pembroke Castle became a fortress in more than stone. Guards were doubled, messengers vetted with suspicion, and Margaret's chambers kept under near-constant watch. Jasper Tudor took no chances. The infant was too valuable, too dangerous to his enemies to be left exposed. Even among servants, trust was rationed carefully. Rumors whispered through the corridors of Yorkist sympathizers in disguise, of plots to steal the child, of poison hidden in a nursemaid's milk. Margaret, still pale and thin from her ordeal, felt the danger pressing in like the cold, damp air off the sea. She seldom let Henry out of her sight, and when she did, it was only into the arms of women she had known since childhood. Her own recovery was slow and painful. Walking more than a few steps left her dizzy, and fever still came and went without warning. Yet she pushed herself to be present for her son's feedings, to watch him breathe as he slept, to study every flicker of expression on his tiny face. In those long, quiet hours, she began to see Henry not only as her child, but as the fragile center of a storm she could not yet see the full shape of. His existence tied her fate to England's shifting power, his survival intertwined with battles and betrayals that would unfold far beyond the nursery. Jasper visited often, his tall frame casting long shadows over the cradle. He spoke to Margaret in low tones about the movements of armies, about which nobles might be courted to the Lancastrian side, about the growing ruthlessness of the Yorkists. He did not spare her from the truth. The child was a threat to their enemies simply by breathing, and those enemies would not hesitate to snuff him out. It was during one such visit that Jasper voiced what Margaret had already begun to suspect. "If the tide turns against us," he said, "we may have to send him away, somewhere far beyond their reach." The thought of parting from Henry stabbed through her like a blade, but she did not argue. She understood. In the chessboard of survival, sentiment could not override necessity. Yet for now he remained in Pembroke, sleeping in a small wooden cradle carved with Tudor roses,
the firelight dancing over his peaceful features. Outside, the winter winds raged against the high walls, but inside, the young mother kept her vigil. She was only 13, her body still mending, her life forever altered, but already she had begun the work that would define her for decades to come, guarding the life that might one day change the course of England itself. In the deep of night, when even the sea seemed to hush, Margaret would lean over the cradle, her hand hovering just above her son's chest to feel the steady rise and fall of his breath. And in those moments, she would whisper a promise, not to fate, not to God, but to Henry himself. "You will live. Whatever it costs me, you will live."
By early spring of 1457, Pembroke's frozen battlements began to thaw, but the world beyond its walls remained treacherous. Messengers brought word of shifting alliances, small skirmishes between Lancastrian and Yorkist forces, and the tightening grip of the rival house across the realm. Each letter Jasper Tudor received seemed to carry the same unspoken truth. The Wars of the Roses were far from over, and the birth of Henry Tudor had already added a dangerous new piece to the board. Margaret's recovery had been slow but steady. Her body remained frail, the damage from childbirth leaving her thin and easily winded, yet her mind was keener than ever. She spent hours in the solar, reviewing family lineages, studying the tangled web of claims to the throne. She could recite not only her own descent from John of Gaunt, but also the legitimacy, or lack thereof, of nearly every noble who might dare wear the crown. Her attendants often urged her to rest more, to spend less time bent over parchments and more time with her embroidery frame. But Margaret had no patience for idle hours. She understood with cold clarity that her survival and Henry's depended on her ability to outthink men who had been playing the game of power far longer than she had been alive. Still, her most guarded hours were those she spent alone with her son. The cradle that once seemed too large for his swaddled form was now just enough for his growing limbs. His tiny fists would clutch her finger with surprising strength, and sometimes she would simply sit in silence, watching his eyes, clear, searching, as if he already sensed the weight of his destiny. Jasper, ever pragmatic, reminded her of the need for contingency. "If we are forced to flee Pembroke," he told her one evening, "we must have allies prepared to shelter him, even if it means sending him across the sea." Margaret listened without flinching. She had long since steeled herself to that possibility. Her love for Henry was fierce, but it was not blind. If keeping him alive meant letting him grow up in exile, then exile it would be. Yet she also began to weave a quieter strategy, building loyalty among the women who nursed and tended him, ensuring that his earliest caregivers would be not only faithful, but willing to risk everything for his safety. These were bonds forged in the daily acts of care, warming milk, rocking him through the night, keeping a watchful eye when strangers entered the chamber. It was in those small, unnoticed moments that Margaret laid the foundation of a network that would one day stretch far beyond Pembroke. She might be a girl in years, but she was already acting as a matriarch, planting seeds for a future where her son could claim more than survival. He could claim a crown. One evening, as dusk deepened and the waves below the castle walls crashed like distant drums, she lifted Henry from his cradle and held him close. His small head fit neatly under her chin, the warmth of his breath brushing her collarbone. In the dim light, her voice was steady, almost ceremonial. "You will not be a pawn, Henry. You will be the player. And I will make certain the board is yours." Outside, the sea wind howled, carrying with it the scent of salt and the promise of storms. Inside, in the quiet of her chamber, a 13-year-old mother sealed the oath that would shape the course of English history. Spring in Pembroke brought bursts of color to the cliffside.
the gorse bushes turning gold, the air sweetened by salt and thaw. But for Margaret, there was no such thing as peace. Each day brought more messengers, and with them tidings of a kingdom fracturing deeper into war. The Yorkist faction, under Edward, Earl of March, was gaining momentum. The Lancastrian court, scattered and desperate, clung to whatever strongholds they still controlled. Jasper Tudor spent fewer nights in Pembroke now. He was often away on campaigns or secret meetings, returning with his cloak stiff from rain and his mind heavy with political calculations. When he was home, he brought news, sometimes cautiously hopeful, more often grim. One evening he arrived bearing a letter sealed with the red rose of Lancaster. Margaret broke the wax herself. It was from Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of the exiled King Henry VI, and it spoke plainly. "The boy is precious. Keep him hidden. Should the crown fall, he may one day be its rightful claimant." Margaret read the words twice before setting the parchment down. The weight of them settled on her like a cloak she could never remove. She had known Henry's blood made him important. Now the Queen herself had confirmed it. He was not merely her son, he was a potential king in waiting, and kings in waiting were hunted. The castle became a hive of caution. Visitors were rare and closely watched. Supplies were brought in from trusted sources. Guards drilled in the courtyard until their shouts echoed against the walls. At night, Margaret sometimes woke to the faint scrape of steel outside her chamber door, a reminder that Henry slept under guard even in his cradle. Her own thoughts sharpened. She began to memorize the faces and loyalties of every man and woman within the keep. Who could be trusted to smuggle her son to safety if the walls were breached? Who might betray them for gold or favor from York? She played these questions over in her mind until they became a private litany. Henry, oblivious to the danger, grew stronger. He kicked against his swaddling, stared intently at the flicker of candle flames, and had begun to smile, something that could melt the most battle-hardened soldier's expression. To Margaret, each sign of life was a small act of defiance against the forces waiting beyond the castle gates. One afternoon, standing at the high window with Henry in her arms, she watched the horizon. The sea was restless, white caps breaking against the rocks far below. She thought of the ships that might one day carry her boy to Brittany, to France, perhaps even further, places where the hand of York could not easily reach. The idea tore at her heart, but she knew it might be the only path to keep him breathing. Behind her, the door opened. Jasper entered, his expression grave. "The fighting has worsened," he said without preamble. "Pembroke may not be safe for long." Margaret turned from the window, her face composed. "Then we will be ready," she replied, and in her tone was something that made Jasper pause, not fear, but the quiet certainty of someone who had already begun moving her pieces on the board. Outside, the gulls wheeled and cried over the cliffs. Inside, a 13-year-old mother tightened her hold on a child who was already more than a son. He was a claim, a cause, and perhaps the future of a crown. The warning came not with the crash of siege engines or the roar of an army, but with the quiet arrival of a single rider at dusk. His horse was lathered, its flanks streaked with mud, and his cloak dripped seawater as though he had crossed more than just land. He asked for Jasper by name, refusing to speak until they were alone. Margaret, confined to her chamber with Henry, sensed the tension as soon as she heard the muffled voices in the corridor. Moments later, Jasper entered, his jaw set. "There are Yorkist scouts in the hills," he said. "They've been sighted less than a day's ride from here." The room seemed to shrink. Margaret's eyes instinctively went to the cradle where Henry slept, his chest rising and falling in slow, oblivious rhythm. "How many?" she asked. "Too few for a siege," he replied, "but enough to take a child if they wanted, and vanish before we could stop them." It was the moment Margaret had feared since the night of his birth.
All her mental rehearsals, all her quiet planning now had to be turned into action. That night, she and Jasper made their preparations. A small, fast sloop was kept moored in a hidden cove beneath the castle, stocked with food, water, and a change of clothes for Henry. If the warning came, she and the boy would be lowered down the cliff by rope under cover of darkness, rowed to the waiting boat, and sent across the channel to Brittany. Jasper would remain behind to hold Pembroke, buying them time. Margaret didn't sleep. She sat in the dim light of the hearth, Henry cradled in her lap, her hand tracing the line of his cheek as she listened for sounds beyond the walls. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind made her heart lurch, yet her face remained calm, her voice soft when she hummed to him. The scouts never came to the gates. Whether deterred by the castle's defenses or called away to some other mission, they melted back into the hills by morning. But the reprieve brought no relief, only the knowledge that the danger was real and could return at any moment. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself altered. She moved with sharper purpose, her mind always measuring distances, weighing escape routes, cataloging the skills and loyalties of those around her. She had been a girl when she first arrived at Pembroke. Now she was something else, a guardian who understood that the cost of failure would be counted in blood. One evening, as she stood on the battlements with Jasper, watching the sun sink behind the black cliffs, he said quietly, "You're stronger than most men I fought beside." Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, where the sea swallowed the light. At last she said, "It's not strength, Jasper, it's necessity." And in that moment, he realized she would not only keep Henry alive, she would shape him, forge him, and one day send him into the world as something far more dangerous than a fugitive child. She would make him a contender.
The scare with the Yorkist scouts faded into memory, but for Margaret, it had been a line crossed. Before, danger had been a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Now it was a constant presence, like the chill in the castle stone. Henry grew quickly through that spring and summer. His cries were stronger, his eyes more alert, and he had begun to grasp at Margaret's hair and the strings of her gown with a determination that made her laugh despite herself. Those small bursts of joy became rare, private treasures, moments she could not afford to show in public, where any softness might be read as weakness. Jasper's visits were shorter now, and when he was away, he sent trusted men to deliver messages. One of them, an older retainer named Rice ap Griffith, began to take a particular interest in Henry, often offering to carry him around the courtyard when the weather was fine. Margaret allowed it, but only after Rice swore loyalty not just to the Tudors, but to the child's life above all else. It was around this time that the whispers began, not just in Pembroke, but in the towns and villages beyond. Travelers spoke of a boy born under a red rose who might one day unite a fractured England. The tales were vague, embroidered with superstition, but they spread nonetheless. Margaret heard them from the lips of a midwife who came to the castle, from merchants who delivered cloth, even from a fisherman who claimed to have heard the story in Tenby. These murmurs stirred both pride and dread in her. Pride, because it meant Henry's name was taking root in the minds of the people. Dread, because every whisper that reached a friend could just as easily reach an enemy. Margaret took to keeping Henry's appearances in the courtyard brief and unpredictable. She also began a subtle campaign of her own. When trusted visitors came, she would speak of his health, his intelligence, his noble blood, but never his vulnerability. In her words, he was already a boy destined for greatness, not a child in need of protection. One warm evening, after the day's heat had softened into a sea-scented breeze, Margaret carried Henry to the western wall. The sky was streaked with crimson, the color of the Lancastrian rose. She stood there, the gulls wheeling overhead, and spoke quietly to him. "They will come for you again," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. "And one day they will not find a helpless babe. They will find the man I have made of you." Henry, of course, understood nothing of her words.
He was busy watching the light play on the waves far below. But Margaret felt the weight of them settle into her bones, the way a soldier feels the heft of his sword. Jasper once told her that in war, the first battle is fought in the mind. If that was true, then she had already begun, and she had no intention of losing.
By autumn of 1457, the world beyond Pembroke was a chessboard in constant motion. Lancastrian strongholds fell and were retaken. Alliances formed in whispers over goblets of wine, only to be broken before the ink on their promises dried. Yet inside the castle walls, Margaret was weaving a quieter, slower game, one made not of armies, but of loyalties. She began with the servants. Each had their own pride, their own grievances, their own price for trust. To the nurse who soothed Henry through fever, Margaret gave a length of fine French linen. To the kitchen boy who carried messages without asking questions, she promised a future place in her household should fortune change. She remembered every kindness, rewarded every discretion, and forgave nothing. Her strategy extended to the garrison as well. Margaret learned their names, asked after their families, listened to their stories of battle and loss. She praised their vigilance when they doubled the watch at night, and she kept a careful ledger in her mind of which men might falter if offered gold or fear. Henry was at the center of all of it, though he remained blissfully unaware. To the soldiers he was our boy, a symbol of the cause they had bled for. To the women of the household he was a future worth guarding, a child whose lineage made every act of care a kind of political duty. Still, Margaret knew loyalty was a fragile currency. People could be bought, threatened, or turned by circumstance. That was why she built layers into her web. If one protector failed, another would step forward. If one door was barred, another would open. She had seen enough of war, even at her young age, to know that survival was rarely a matter of luck. It was the result of preparation so meticulous that to an outsider it might look like providence. One night, after Henry had drifted to sleep, Margaret sat by the fire with Jasper. The logs hissed and popped, throwing sparks against the stone hearth. "You've been busy," he said, studying her with the faintest trace of amusement. "Busy?" she asked, feigning innocence. "You've turned Pembroke into a fortress," he replied. "Not with walls or soldiers, but with people. They'd bleed for you now." Margaret's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "For him," she corrected, glancing toward the cradle. "Always for him." Jasper leaned back in his chair, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Then God help anyone who tries to take him." Outside, the wind swept in from the sea, rattling the shutters. Inside, the quiet crackle of the fire seemed almost conspiratorial, as if it too understood that the boy sleeping in the cradle was not just a child, but a claim, a cause, and a spark that could one day set England alight.
The first frost came early that year, crisping the fields around Pembroke into a pale silver. With it came news, delivered by a rider so exhausted that his words stumbled over each other, that Yorkist forces had clashed with Lancastrians near Ludlow. It was a rout. The king and queen had fled, and the Earl of March, Edward, was rising like a new star in the north. Margaret listened without flinching, though her fingers tightened around the chair's armrest. The air between her and Jasper, who stood by the hearth, was heavy with the unspoken truth. The war was tilting. "What does it mean for us?" she asked. Jasper's voice was flat. "It means we hold Pembroke until they come for it, and they will come." That night, the sea wind brought more than cold. It carried a scent Margaret recognized from childhood hunting trips with her father. Blood. Not literal, but the same iron tang she'd felt before hounds ran down a deer. Somewhere out there, men were moving toward them, steel in hand, convinced of their cause. Margaret doubled the guard and kept Henry close, never more than a room away. Even when she slept,
She dressed in a heavy gown, her cloak laid out beside her, ready for flight. She imagined waking in the dead of night to the clang of steel and the shouts of men, the rush down the winding stairs, the rope descent to the waiting sloop. She rehearsed it until her mind could run through the steps faster than her feet ever could. But days passed, and the assault did not come. Instead, strange tidings reached them. Yorkist captains demanding parley, merchants offering gifts of food and wine that could not be trusted. It was not an army that approached Pembroke, but something subtler, the first probing fingers of siege. In the courtyard, she caught sight of Rhys ap Gruffydd speaking to a man she didn't recognize. When she asked, Rhys claimed it was an old friend bringing salted fish from Milford Haven. Margaret smiled, took the fish herself, and ordered it thrown into the sea. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. One evening, while walking the battlements with Henry wrapped in furs against her chest, she saw torches flickering far off along the coastal road. Too many to be harmless. Jasper joined her, following her gaze. "They're coming," he said quietly. Margaret did not look away from the distant lights. "Then let them come," she replied, her voice calm as the winter sea. "They'll find more than they expected." Below them, waves crashed against the black rocks, their rhythm steady, relentless, as if echoing the beat of a resolute that had already hardened in her bones.
The Yorkists arrived not in a roar of banners and war cries, but in the slow tightening of a noose. Their campfires sprouted like malignant stars on the hills beyond Pembroke, too far for arrows, yet close enough to remind everyone inside that they were watched. They did not charge the gates. They cut the roads. They harassed supply lines. The market towns that once sent grain and salted meat to the castle now found their wagons confiscated by armed men in the name of King Edward. Fishermen reported that strange boats lingered just beyond the harbor mouth, silent as sharks. Inside the walls, life constricted. Meals grew smaller. Candles were burned to their stubs. The garrison rotated watches in shorter, harsher shifts, their faces pale with exhaustion. Margaret felt the weight of every choice she made. How much flour to use for bread, how many arrows to loose when scouts drew too near, how long to let the men rest before the next drill. Henry, still barely more than a toddler, sensed the tension in the air. He clung to her skirts when strangers passed, and woke often at night crying at sounds only he seemed to hear. Margaret held him in the dark, whispering songs her own mother had sung, songs of endurance, of outlasting storms. Jasper moved constantly between the walls and the courtyard, his boots never dry, his voice low and sharp when he spoke to his captains. Yet even he knew what Margaret had already begun to suspect. The Yorkists weren't here for a battle. They were here for her boy. One morning, a herald rode up under a flag of truce. His words were polished, almost friendly. Pembroke's surrender in exchange for safe passage for all within the walls. Margaret stood beside Jasper as the offer was read. She saw the trap in it instantly. Safe passage for all meant nothing if all did not include Henry in the same breath as herself. When the herald asked for her answer, she met his gaze with the same composure she might have used at court. "Tell your masters that they will have my son only when they prize him from my arms, and that day will be costly." The herald's face did not change, but something in his eyes flickered. Whether respect or pity, she could not tell. He bowed and rode back down the hill. As the days bled into weeks, Margaret's resolve only sharpened. She began to imagine not just surviving this siege, but turning it into a test, one that would teach every soul in Pembroke that the boy they guarded was worth any hardship, any danger. If the Yorkists wanted Henry Tudor, they would have to learn the truth she already knew. His life was not a prize to be taken.
It was a cause to be fought for, and she had no intention of losing.